Hello everybody, this is Philip Jonas at Kalamazoo Valley Community College presenting OpenStax Principles of Economics, and today we're covering sections 13.1 through 13.3. In this module you will learn to explain and give examples of positive externalities, to contrast equilibrium and socially optimal price and quantity, use excludability and rivalry to identify public goods and common resources, and use game theory to explain the free rider problem. So in our last module, we had a look at markets that are plagued by negative externalities, spillover effects from the buyer and seller in the market that have a cost imposed on outsiders. Here in our new module, we're now looking at positive externalities, which are a very similar spillover idea, but this time in a positive, a good direction. Benefits are being incurred to outsiders, which at first seems like it would be less of a problem than a negative spillover effect, but just like with the negative spillovers, the existence of positive externalities also leads to markets not producing the efficient quantity unless we tweak with a little bit of intervention. So let's start out by discussing the terminology, which is very similar to the negative externality terminology. We are going to distinguish here between the benefit of the product that goes to the person buying or consuming it, calling that a private benefit. And then we have an additional benefit that's going to people outside of the transaction, our external benefit or our positive spillover. Now, if we combine both of those together, we get the social benefit of a product, the combination of both the private and external benefit. So once again, we're going to start out by looking at this in the context of a supply and demand model. Let's say we are looking at a market for a product that has a positive spillover, such as, classic example, a flu vaccine. Getting the flu vaccine doesn't just benefit yourself, but you're also keeping yourself from spreading the flu to others. So classic division there between there's a benefit to me, and then above and beyond that, to get to the social benefit, we have to add our positive externality. So in the absence of any additional sort of encouragement to get that flu shot, we of course expect a market outcome which will be formed by the equilibrium of the supply curve, representing the marginal cost of production of a flu shot, and the demand curve, which of course only represents the private benefit of these flu shots, right? When I decide if that price is worth it to me, maybe I'm just going for strict self-interest here and only taking my own benefit into account. But we're now going to contrast that with the social benefit of this shot, which is larger than the private benefit, since by definition it includes the private benefit, but also the positive spillover. And you can already see where this is going. Really similar to our discussion of negative externalities, we are drawing a distinction between the equilibrium outcome, so that's the first demand curve I showed you, just the ordinary market demand curve. Right here, equilibrium outcome, market price, market quantity. We're going to contrast that with the socially optimal outcome being formed by the intersection of the social benefit of the product, or if you want to think of it in this fashion, a social demand curve. You've got to ask yourself if really there is a social demand curve, since not necessarily society as a whole is paying for these shots, but you see the direction that all of this is going, right? So where with a negative externality, because outsiders were not being compensated for the damage being imposed to them, markets by themselves produce too much of the things that have negative externalities. You see the inverse result here with our positive externality. The market quantity is too small relative to the socially optimal one. So if we just leave the market to its own devices, not as many people get flu shots as they should. Likewise, that's because at the margin, the social benefit is much higher here at the socially optimal outcome than the market price at the equilibrium outcome. So if we could somehow put this social benefit into this market so that this higher price was available to the sellers of the flu shot, then they'd be willing to supply this many flu shots. But of course, the problem is already at the market price, not enough people want to buy the flu shot. And then if we make the price even higher at the market demand curve, well, at that higher price here, at the market demand curve, we'd end up with even fewer people getting the shot. We'd have a surplus of shots. So what we have to do here is we got to get that price up that the sellers receive so that they produce more flu shots. But we also got to get the price down that the buyers have to pay so that more buyers want to get it as well. You can already tell this is the opposite of a tax, right? Like with a tax, buyers have to pay more, sellers receive less, and that reduces the quantity produced. So very handy if you're trying to combat a negative externality. Let's put a pollution charge in place. That'll reduce how much pollution is generated. Now we need the opposite. We need to encourage a higher quantity. So instead of a tax, we are going to do a subsidy. We're going to add money to the transaction, irrelevant if we give it to the seller or to the buyer, whatever's more convenient to organize. That's going to increase the amount of money that the sellers receive while decreasing the price that buyers have to pay. As always, incidence is being governed by elasticity, but we're not going to get into that. So what is this ideal subsidy? Well, we're trying to get to the socially optimal quantity. So right here, second dashed line, we need the price that sellers receive to be this high, but the price that buyers pay to be this much less. So this gap right here, we're going to fill that in with a subsidy for the product, in this case the flu shots. That way the price that the producers receive all the way up here, price consumers pay all the way down here, and we end up with the socially optimal quantity. Let me repeat that one more time. If you've got an ordinary positive externality you're looking at, and the value of this externality is, whatever the vertical distance is between these demand curves, give a subsidy equal to the external benefit, so how much more outsiders are benefiting above what the insiders get. Thereby, you're basically putting the benefit to the outsiders inside the market. We sometimes call that internalizing an externality. And bam, you end up with the correct quantity. Now, this is looking at positive externalities in a standard supply and demand model, but I want to briefly show you another perspective simply because it comes up a lot when discussing positive externalities. One type of positive externality that tends to be thought about a lot in economics is anything that advances our society from either sort of a technological or a cultural level. And again, the concern is, hey, if you make something, you invent the better mousetrap or you write the great novel, yes, you're benefiting directly from inventing or writing this, and so is the reader and the direct user of your invention, but it also improves the rest of society. It gives a higher baseline for the next level of progress to be built on. So again, we're concerned there's a positive spillover here, and if we just let the market do its thing, we don't get enough invention and creative expression. So one particular type of subsidy that we use here, not the only type, just one particular type that you may have heard of before, is the notion of intellectual property. Let's give the creators a monopoly on the product for a certain amount of time. That way they can make more profit, which hopefully encourages more creation of these types to begin with, of the intellectual property, and thereby lead society to advance further. And we've got a little bit of a distinction there. I'm just going to mention it really briefly so that you've heard these terms. This isn't exactly a course on intellectual property. But over on the invention side, we have so-called patents. You've probably heard of these. And those last for 20 years. So you get a 20-year monopoly for inventing the better mousetrap. And then over on the creative works, writings, music, movies, other things, we get a much longer term, 95 years if it's a corporate creation or if it's an individual author or creator, until they are dead, plus 70 years after that. So it is a little bit interesting how the duration of the monopolies varies so much between these two. Now, the reason I want to mention this is a slightly different context, is that we often talk about this in terms of how much financial capital these creators want to raise to begin with, to either borrow or other types of funding mechanisms. We've not really talked in this course very much about this, but the idea here being that we have a supply of financial capital, whatever the current opportunity cost of capital is. And now we're representing the creator or the company here as the demand curve. So how much reward, how much profit are they expecting? And as a consequence of that, how much financial capital will they borrow? And again, the distinction we're drawing here is on a private level, the direct reward that the creators receive will lead to a certain amount of borrowing. But if we take the positive spillovers into account, the value of these intellectual property products is actually higher, and we should put more resources into creating these sorts of things. So this is the background for the notion of intellectual property. You give that additional monopoly power to the creators or the companies, as a consequence of which there are more profits down the line, which of course means more projects are worth undertaking, more borrowing takes place, more works get created. It should go without saying, you have to balance that. As we learned in our module on monopoly, while the creators have the intellectual monopoly, they are going to charge much higher prices. So there's a consumer harm there, right? And you want to see how much positive spillover you think you're causing versus how much consumer harm because of those higher prices. All right, so these are ordinary positive externalities. But for the rest of this module, we're now going to go a little bit deeper, because positive externalities aren't just related when it comes to products being sold in the market and then some outsiders benefit, but they are also certain types of products that behave differently from most of what we've implicitly discussed so far in this course. And as a consequence, market solutions, this is very questionable if they are the right way to go to begin with, or if we want to go with a market solution, we're going to need some pretty heavy intervention. So let me tell you what this is all about. In economics, we look at two major characteristics of products to see how they behave. They are called rivalry and excludability. And the first time you hear about them, they sound very similar, but actually refer to two different things. So rivalry is the idea, does making a product make it worse or unavailable for others to use? And most products behave this way. Like if you sit in a chair, while I'm sitting in here, nobody else can sit in this chair. That makes the chair rivalrous. So that's just unavailable, right? It can also be about consumption. Let's say I've got an apple, I eat the apple is literally consumed, it's gone, you can't eat the apple anymore. That's a very strong type of rivalry. It can also just be an inconvenience. If a bus is crowded, additional people come on the bus, crowding gets worse, that's rivalry. And then number two, excludability refers to whether you can prevent people from using or having the product to begin with. We don't think about this very often, but you need excludability to be able to charge for a product to begin with. And if you can't charge for a product, the whole idea of a market transaction sort of falls apart. So even that crowded bus still has a door and can say, hey, pay the fare or you don't get on. That makes it excludable. Just about sort of any physical trinket you can transfer is excludable, right? I can put like a vase on a shelf in the store, give me the money, you get the vase. If you don't give me the money, you don't get the vase. But there is a very interesting subcategory of products that don't have this excludability feature. So charging for them is a real problem. Think, for example, of operating a lighthouse, a classic economics example, right? So like it's a light source, it warns ships, there's a dangerous obstacle over here. It does it through a bright light. And you can't very well say, hey, only ships who have paid can see this light. So this often happens in the area of safety, but it's not the only area, right? Like, let's talk about sort of the opposite of safety. If you put a fireworks display on in a downtown park, everybody can see it. It's going to be really hard to charge for that fireworks display. So those are rivalry and excludability. And as you can probably already tell, most products have these two features. They are both sort of, we compete with each other for use, but you can also charge for it. And implicitly, those sorts of products are what we've been discussing in this entire course. We call them private goods in economics. And if you've got private goods, markets work well. That's why we've been talking so much about markets. Markets work well even if you think that people should get support in affording these products, or that the government should provide some of these products. So for example, if we say, let's give people some support in food, it's not a very modern type of thinking to say, hey, we're going to have the government grow some food, put it in some boxes, send it to people. That ends up being not very efficient. It's much more efficient to just say, hey, the market is great at providing food. If we want more people to have more food, we can just give them money to buy the food. And maybe if we want to, depending on how we feel about it, we can set that up as sort of a restricted fund that can only be spent on food. There's always a debate if you want to make that general or restricted. That's your private goods. But then at the opposite end, sort of the very well-defined cases, we have public goods that aren't rivalrous. So like the lighthouse, everybody can see it. If I see the lighthouse, I'm not taking away from anybody else. But you also can't charge for them, like the lighthouse, unless you have like a very weird roundabout way. Maybe you could have like an ad that gets displayed by the lighthouse. Oh well, I digress. Here, markets don't work right because of a problem called the free rider problem that I'll discuss in a second. But long story short, if you want public goods to exist, if you think, hey, it's important to have a lighthouse right here, you'll almost certainly end up with a decision of, well, the government's probably going to have to run that lighthouse or at least pay for it. Now, these are the very extreme cases. Private goods, markets just sort of rocket. Public goods, oh boy, maximum government intervention. Then there's also some mixed cases, very interesting. We'll talk about one of them today, the common resources, goods where we take away from each other, but everybody can access them. And there you have an additional problem where people will basically deplete this resource, overuse it, destroy it. We'll look at it. So here, government's also going to have to step in and say, markets by themselves don't limit use for this product like they should, so we're going to have to introduce some usage limit. Good news, it's the exact same techniques we discussed when we talked about negative externalities. We probably just want to put a pollution charge in place or maybe some marketable permits. We can call it a day. And then something we'll not discuss, which is frankly a very complicated category, are the so-called club goods, where we don't take away from each other, but you can charge for them because you can keep people out. Like a club, unless it's like super overcrowded, letting another person in doesn't really cost anything. But you can certainly decide if you want to let another person in, so you are able to charge for it. And this one gets complicated because every approach we have has some real downsides, from market-based to government intervention. So what you want to do with club goods really depends on the finer features of that particular market. So let me show you what the problem is. We call it the free rider problem with public goods and common resources. In order to make really sense of this, let me introduce you to just a first introduction of game theory. So game theory actually is very important in economics because it describes how people interact with each other in strategic situations. By which we mean situations where what happens to me isn't just affected by my choices, but by the combination of my choices and your choices. Now, you may have heard about this before, but one sort of prediction you can solve game theoretic situations for, it's a really solid prediction, is the so-called Nash equilibrium. So I'm not going to show you how to do this, but as a preview, what we're talking about is a Nash equilibrium is a situation where no player would want to individually change their behavior. It would always be bad for them to change their behavior unless the other player changes their behavior as well. And as such, it's a sort of stable outcome for a game, something that quite often takes place. And to introduce you to it, I will tell you about the most classic game of them all, the so-called Prisoner's Dilemma. So the Prisoner's Dilemma is a game that speaks to a conflict between individual and group incentives. There isn't always a conflict between individual and group incentives. Sometimes if you do what's best for yourself, it's actually also great for the group. But the reason we always bring this one up is because it's a great explanation for why cooperation can be difficult to maintain. The Prisoner's Dilemma. There are various flavors of the story. The way I'm going to tell it is, we've got two individuals here, Bonnie and Clyde. They were arrested for bank robbery. But it's not an ironclad case. Like, there's some evidence, they'll probably go to prison for a while, but a confession would really help the prosecutor out a lot here. So, of course, what's going to happen after they get arrested? They get separated so that they don't have an opportunity to coordinate. And then we will have maybe a nice and maybe a not so nice detective tell them a little bit about their options of what they can do in this situation. And we're going to write these options up in what's called a payoff matrix. So matrix, because each payoff of what you decide to do doesn't just depend on what you do, but what the other person does as well. So right now, of course, over here in the matrix, you're seeing a whole bunch of numbers, probably wondering what they mean. I'll show you all of this, but let me tell you the deal that's being offered for starters. There's enough evidence here, even if Bonnie and Clyde say nothing, they're going to go to prison for 5 years. But a confession would go a long way. If your partner confesses that the two of you committed this crime, it's going to add 9 years to that sentence. However, if you confess, this is what the very nice investigator tells you, if you confess, we will give you immunity from your own confession and subtract 4 years from your sentence for good cooperation. So let's have a look at how this can play out in the form of a payoff matrix. So there's a couple standard terms I want to introduce here. Let me highlight them real quick. The payoff matrix has two sides on which we have the players of our game. So Bonnie, if you almost want to think of this as a table they're sitting at, is at the top. Clyde on the left side. You don't always have to set them up as top and left side, but it's a really common setup. Next, along their sides, we show their strategies. So this is basically what they can choose to do. And this is a so-called symmetric game. So what they can do, same options before both of them with the same consequences. So Bonnie can choose, I can confess, I can remain silent. Clyde can choose, I can confess, I can remain silent. We are only going to be discussing these sort of on-off pure strategies. Just FYI, Nash equilibrium can also include mixed randomized strategies. Like, for example, if you were to do a payoff matrix for rock, paper, scissors, there's not going to be one move that always dominates, right? The dominant strategy is you randomize between those three options. And now comes the really important part, the reason this thing is called a payoff matrix. We have two players with two strategies giving us 4 possible outcomes. And in those possible outcomes, we have the payoffs to each player. So you notice the commas here, right? That separates what happens to player 1 and player 2. Over here on the left, the first number represents the outcome to Clyde. You'll recognize these as years as in prison, which is why we've got a negative in front of the numbers, because these are bad things happening to Clyde. Or in other words, every time you set up one of these games, you want to set it up so that a larger number is better for the player. Like -1 is better for Clyde than -14. And then likewise, player at the top is the second number that's being represented. So what happens to each player doesn't just depend on what both players do, but also it affects what happens to both players. Thus, a strategic situation, right? So for example, if Bonnie confesses and Clyde also confesses, Bonnie gets 10 years. But if Bonnie remains silent while Clyde confesses, that's gonna send her to prison for 14 years. All right, so this is the setup of our game, the payoff matrix. The way you solve for the Nash equilibrium is that you find any outcome here that's a best response for both players. Anything that's a best response for all players, by definition, Nash equilibrium. There's a little trick here that I was taught when I was in school that I think makes them really easy to find in these payoff matrices. So what we have to do, best response is, we're putting ourselves in the position of one player and then asking ourselves, even though we don't know what the other player is going to do, well, how would I react if I did know? That's best response. So let's put ourselves in Clyde's position. We are in Clyde's position, but you'll notice I've highlighted Bonnie confessing. Why is that? Because we start out by thinking about what does the other person do. So we're picking Clyde's best response if Clyde knew that Bonnie is going to confess. So we have to look at Clyde's payoffs here. That's the first one in our payoff numbers. If Clyde confesses, that sends him to prison for 10 years. But if he doesn't and Bonnie does, that's 14 years in prison. So Clyde thinks about these two, picks the best response. Which one's the best response? Well, the one that's less time in prison, right? And now comes the little trick I was taught as an undergrad. Put a check mark next to the payoff here to Clyde that's associated with the best response. So Clyde's best response to Bonnie confessing is that Clyde wants to confess. Put a check mark next to Clyde's -10. That'll make it really easy to keep track of the best responses. So we're not done with Clyde yet, right? Clyde also has to pick a response to anything else Bonnie might do. Well, there's only one other option here. Bonnie might remain silent. So again, from Clyde's perspective, if Bonnie remains silent, we've got a -1 or a -5. -1's better. Check mark it. So now we've got Clyde's best responses, and it turns out Clyde's got a so-called dominant strategy here. Clyde's best response is always to do the same thing, to confess. No matter what Bonnie does, confessing is superior for Clyde. Let's put ourselves in Bonnie's shoes, who is of course in a symmetric situation, but we got to get used to looking at this from both players' perspectives. So now, Bonnie, we're picking the best response. So we have to think about, what's Clyde doing? Well, what if Clyde confesses? That puts us in the top row of the game. Bottom row is sort of locked out if Clyde confesses. So Bonnie can now choose, do I confess? Do I remain silent? If I confess, -10. If I remain silent, -14. -10 beats -14. Check mark it. And finally, Bonnie has to think about, what if Clyde does not confess to any involvement here? So Clyde remains silent. -1, -5 are the possible outcomes of that for Bonnie, right? Clyde's choice now effect on Bonnie. Bonnie looks at, if I confess, -1, if I remain silent, -5. -1 beats -5, check mark it. There we are. We only have two players, two strategies. So that means you get yourself to 4 check marks and you are done. At this point, you can identify a Nash equilibrium. Reminder, Nash equilibrium means best response for both players. So we're looking for the spot where we have 2 check marks, because that way it's the best response for both of them. And where's our double check mark? Right here. Confess, confess. So formally speaking, the Nash equilibrium is a Nash equilibrium here. I mean, the check marks are kind of a shorthand to get this done, because neither player benefits by unilaterally deviating. If from this position Clyde individually switches to silent, his sentence increases from 10 to 14 years. If Bonnie unilaterally switches to silent, her sentence increases from 10 to 14. Neither one of them wants to change strategy individually. But now, of course, you start to see why the prisoner's dilemma is so famous. Even though each player is pursuing their self-interest, the outcome is actually not the best outcome for both players, right? Here's -10, -10. Bonnie and Clyde would both be better off if they both remain silent. -5, -5. It's not just that one of them would, both of them would be better off if they both remain silent. But that's not an equilibrium outcome. It is really hard to maintain cooperation when it's against your own best response interest. And that's what makes the Nash equilibrium in the prisoner's dilemma so famous, because it can illustrate why cooperation can be difficult even if everybody benefits from cooperation. So of course, this is not a criminal justice course, so let's say goodbye to our prisoners here and get back to economics. The reason we have to talk about this in the context of positive externalities is that we have two product categories: public goods and common resources, who suffer from such a cooperation problem. So first, the public goods. These are the ones that are not excludable and not rivalrous, like the lighthouse example, right? So these suffer from what we call a free rider problem, where some ships would be really tempted to use that lighthouse but not pay for it, because even if they don't pay for it, they can still see it, right? Then the common resources, it gets even worse. Common resources are not excludable, just like the public goods, and they are rivalrous to boot. We reduce each other's quality of the product when more of us use it. So not only are free riders going to enjoy these benefits without paying, in addition to that double problem, they will also use too much of the product because there's no incentive to hold back. Now, let me say it one more time. The public goods, the common resources, they're kind of special cases. Most of the time, we're talking about the private goods where the markets work well and we don't have this free rider problem. Private goods still can have other problems, like externalities, right? Like monopoly problems. We've discussed those as well. We've got some known solutions to those as well. But now we're talking about one particular subclass of products with one particular problem setting that is very closely related to the idea of the prisoner's dilemma, and that's the free rider problem. So let's start out by talking about a public good. And my example here is going to be a tornado siren. So similar to a lighthouse, everybody can hear the tornado siren. That's kind of the point of a tornado siren, right? You can't make it excludable, you'd be missing the point. And you being warned by a tornado siren doesn't make it any harder for anybody else to hear the tornado siren. So it's not rivalrous as well. Now, when I first introduced the prisoner's dilemma to you, I was putting into the payoff matrix directly the number of years that our prisoners would go to prison. But very commonly in game theory, we actually make our life a little bit easier and we simply rank the outcomes, because it doesn't matter what the exact numbers are. All that matters is bigger number is better. So we've got 4 possible payoffs here with the tornado siren. Let's go through them. Worst possible outcome for our players. What if you pay for a tornado siren, but nobody else pays for the tornado siren? It's all on you. Now, with our little bit of game theory we're doing here, we're doing 2-player games. So you might be thinking to yourself, okay, well, it's not going to raise costs that much, whether it's one person paying for it or 2, that's just double the cost. But really, public goods are situations where we can have thousands or millions of people sharing a product. So imagine for a second that we were doing fancier math with 100,000 people living in a city talking about a tornado siren. The worst possible outcome for you would be you are the chosen one that has to pay for the entire tornado siren for the entire city. Nobody else contributes, right? So that's why we rank that all the way at the bottom. Okay, what's slightly better here? Outcome number 2, you don't have to pay, but nobody else pays either. So there's no benefit. There's no tornado siren. Now, number 3, full cooperation if you want. Everybody pays their share. So the tornado siren is affordable. And we get a tornado siren out of the deal, which, if everybody pays their fair share, is totally worth it to people. And then finally, best selfish outcome for an individual. Everybody else pays for the tornado siren, so it's available. But you specifically don't have to, because you're the special one. Even better, right? Get the tornado siren, don't have to pay your taxes. So let's look through our matrix here, how these play out. If everybody pays the fee to get the tornado siren, we've got the shared cost and the tornado siren exists. If everybody tries to be a free rider, well, then nobody pays and the tornado siren doesn't exist. And then worst possible outcome, one person decides to pay, nobody else does. So they have to pay by themselves. Everybody else very happy, get a tornado siren for free. So 1 and 4 in those boxes. Let's solve and illustrate the problem of a tornado siren. By the way, let's right up front notice, so what's the best collective outcome here, of course? Everybody pays for the tornado siren, right? Like that's the one we would want. But how's this going to work? Well, let's start in the position of player 1. What if player 2, which is sort of a stand-in for everybody else in the town from the perspective of player 1, decides to pay the fee to get the tornado siren? Well, now from our perspective, player 1 here, yeah, we could pay the fee. We get the siren. Pretty good. You know what's better? We don't pay the fee. We free ride. Everybody else pays for the tornado siren. Woo! Free tornado siren, right? Okay, so check mark. 4 beats 3. Option 2. Player 2 decides to free ride. Nobody else pays for the tornado siren. Okay, our options now. We buy a tornado siren all by ourselves for the entire city. Terrible. Or we also don't pay anything and nobody gets a tornado siren. Slightly better. Check. Turn the tables. Put yourself in the position of player 2. Consider if player 1 pays the fee. Options available to me, left and right. 3 or 4. 4 beats 3. Check mark. And if player 1 free rides, they basically choose the bottom row here. I, as player 2, get to choose left and right. So 1 or 2. 2 beats 1. And check mark. Let's check for the Nash equilibrium. Nash equilibrium of a public good is nobody pays because everybody tries to free ride on everybody else. So markets here fail. So what can you do in this type of situation? Well, 2 types of solutions. Number 1, you can say, okay, we're going to have a tornado siren, but the government's going to pay for it. We're going to have this thing be tax funded, right? That's a very standard solution. Have the government provide public goods. And let me emphasize, this makes everybody better off, because basically what we're doing is we're forcing everybody to pay the fee. That's the taxes. The government gives the benefit of the tornado siren, and we get to the payoffs 3-3 as opposed to 2-2. Everybody's better off when we've got a tornado siren. There is a second solution. Doesn't work out as much if we're talking about one central product like a tornado siren, but works out for other situations like car insurance, for example. Car insurance has a public good characteristic to it. If you get insurance, it's not just for your benefit. It's so that if you hurt somebody else, they are protected as well. So most of us would probably prefer to live in a world where everybody has car insurance as opposed to nobody has car insurance. So how do we do it with the car insurance? We say, well, if you're going to be out there on the public roads, you just have to have car insurance. Not to cover your own losses, but to cover the harm you could cause others. That's called a mandate. When the government doesn't directly provide a product, I mean, that would be another solution. Government could say, we'll be the insurance company, but I don't know if we like that, right? Maybe we do. It's your choice. But second solution is government says, no, go ahead and buy yourself your own insurance, but you do have to buy insurance, and here are the minimum specs of what you have to buy. Now, one word of caution here. It is true that public goods represent a type of market failure, and that you can fix this market failure through mandates or tax funding. But just because a thing is a public good doesn't automatically mean that the benefit exceeds the cost. So you still want to do that cost-benefit analysis. Is it even worth it to have a tornado siren? Like, if you're somewhere where tornadoes don't happen, a tornado siren is still a public good, but a public good that costs money and provides no benefit. So in that case, you don't want to go ahead and have the government build tornado sirens just because they are public good. You still have to decide if the product is worth it. But if you decide it's worth it, then mandates or tax funding are the way you can fix the issue. So that's public goods. People left to their own devices won't pay for these things. Common resources have the same problem. And then in addition to that, people will overuse them because they are rivalrous. Can't overuse a tornado siren as the person listening to it. Like, it doesn't take away from anybody else listening to it. Now, with the common resources, we can have both problems. People have to come together to pay for it, and we have to limit use. For example, if we have some sort of downtown traffic congestion situation in a very large city, those roads will have to be paid for by the government. Private roads in a downtown environment are not really going to work. And we probably want to limit how much people drive on the roads so that the congestion isn't completely out of line. But with common resources, we can also talk about things that we don't have to provide to begin with, that pre-exist in nature, and all we have to focus on is limiting use. Most environmental problems can be thought of as common resource problems. So let's just focus on the second problem here of the common resources, overuse. Another classic example, I'll go to ocean fishing. So if you're out beyond the exclusive economic zones of a country and you can just sort of fish, there is a real sustainability problem. Once again, we've got a payoff matrix here. Let's say we have these two players as stand-ins for tens of thousands of fishers on their fishing boats. And here are their possible individual payoffs. Worst possible outcome is you try to fish sustainably, everybody else doesn't. The fish go extinct and you get nothing. Only slightly better. You participate in the overfishing, at least you make some money, but the fish still go extinct because everybody else is doing it. Pretty good. You fish sustainably, everybody else fishes sustainably, the population of fish is going to be protected. And then selfishly, of course, best outcome, you yourself overfish, but you're just one of, 10,000 boats. As long as everybody else fishes sustainably, population is protected, and you make the big profits. As always, bigger number, higher payoff. So we can already identify the socially optimal outcome here. Everybody fishes sustainably, 3-3, that gives us the best combination. We can already see, that's not nearly as good as everybody overfishing and making the fish go extinct. But of course, a problem we're going to run into that individually overfishing would be really great if everybody else was acting sustainably. So you see where this is going, right? It's going to be the prisoner's dilemma again, but let's look at it one more time. So let's start in the shoes of player 1, considering our best response to player 2 overfishing. Player 2 here is the stand-in for all other fishing boats. If we act sustainably, fish still go extinct and we get nothing. We also overfish, well, at least we get something. Bam, best response, overfish. Everybody else acts sustainably. Well, if we act sustainably, good for us, right? But if we overfish, it's just us. No big harm to the fish population. 4 beats 3, check mark. Turn the tables. Now we're player 2, considering what we're going to do if player 1 acts sustainably. 4 beats 3, we want to overfish. Check. So let's consider what we want to do here if player 1 overfishes. 2 beats 1, well then we want to overfish as well. Bam bam, 2 check marks. That of course represents a Nash equilibrium. Nash equilibrium is everybody overfishes and the fish go extinct, even though everybody would be better off if everybody was acting sustainably. Again, private incentive, conflict with collective good. So how do we fix it? Well, here we have to limit some use, and it's the same solutions as we saw with negative externalities. We can introduce a pollution charge, extra tax for every fish you catch until fishing is at a sustainable level. We can introduce marketable permits, a little bit more natural if we're talking, for example, about fishing, limited amount of annual fishing that we permit, but we'll let the fishing boats buy and sell those permits to one another so that the most efficient boats end up with the permits. And then, of course, finally, if you must, you can do command and control regulation. But remember, that's typically less efficient and more costly, so only roll that out if you've got a problem where, you must go to command and control. Like we're at the edge of extinction, we're just like, nope, absolutely no fishing on this right now, ban it. Same as always with the public goods, of course. Just because something is a common resource doesn't mean taxing or permitting it has benefits that exceed the cost. Look at the actual harm that would be being caused by overuse. Maybe it isn't worth introducing a regulatory system. Like you live in a less busy downtown, smaller city, once a day for half an hour, there's a bit of a traffic jam downtown. Yes, that's a common resource problem. You could solve the traffic jam by introducing a toll for driving downtown, by introducing downtown driving permits that are tradable, by having a command and control system. It's probably overkill because the problem is very small and the cost of implementing a solution overrides the benefit you would actually receive here. So this is our final example here of using game theory to explain the problems with public goods and common resources. Let me just mention one more time. We were focusing on one narrow area of game theory here where individual incentives lead to a collective bad. I don't want you walking away thinking that's the default situation in game theory, that in general when people do what's good for themselves, it ends up ruining it for everybody. No. Most of the time it's actually perfectly fine. We're rolling out game theory in a way to cover the special case here where individual incentives run just completely counter to what the collective good is. So with that, in this module, you hopefully learned how to explain and give examples of positive externalities, how to contrast equilibrium and socially optimal price and quantity, how to use excludability and rivalry to identify public goods and common resources, and how to use game theory to explain the free rider problem. I will see you next time.